Welcome to all of you who just have entered now. Welcome to this first Crescendo Lounge. But the topic is my calling as an artist still valid? This question would have been without any special relevance 1 year ago. But now many artists are asking this in a very serious way. These next minutes will help us to find answers. First, by listening to David Chan being interviewed by Delta David Gier. Then we will give you a short spiritual food for thoughts and questions for breakout groups. And finally, we will be gathered again for a final round in the big chat room. So it's a great joy for us to introduce with few words our special guests for today. First, David Chan. He is since 20 years concertmaster of the Metropolitan Orchestra and Professor at Juilliard. And he is also active as a conductor. And some of you might have read the recent tuning and having read his deep thoughts. David is a great lover of God, of his wife and family, and of music, of course, but also a lover of good red wines. And this leads me actually to say some words about Delta David Gier, who shares the same passion. He is the artistic director of South Dakota Symphony. His Lakota project involving Native American composers is very innovative, and his way of programming is terrific. And also the Wall Street Journal praises him for this. He just actually made it to the Hall of Fame in South Dakota. He has conducted many world famous orchestras such as the New York Philharmonic and the Crescendo Summer Institute Orchestra in Tokai. He is the leader of Crescendo USA. David and David, welcome. It's a great joy to meet you here, and may I give you both the mic.
Yes, thank you, Bats. That's funny. Yeah, David, we didn't talk about red wine the other day, and we'll have to find that discussion at some point. Yeah.
Yes, well, I'm delighted to be here and to have this chance to share some thoughts with all of you and to converse with you, David. But yeah, don't forget my great love of excellent white wines as well.
We have some people here in the chat who are actually closer, as Mark is very close to France and your passion.
Well, and of course, at some point we'll have to welcome you to Tokai, which has it's very distinctive white wines, not so much the red. But David, let's begin by if you would just briefly outline your biography, your path towards music, concertmaster of the Metropolitan Opera, but also your path to Christ.
Well, I grew up in Southern California in San Diego, and I was a fairly typical music student, of first generation Taiwanese immigrants. My parents met in the States in graduate school, moved down to San Diego, have never left. I was born there, and when they encountered a preschool presentation from Suzuki teachers saying that students who study music do better at reading and math, like our son is doing that. And it was certainly not with music as an end goal, but through some twists and turns, that's where it ended up. And I did my undergraduate at Harvard, partially out of my own interest, partially out of reassuring the parents that I would have a backup plan if this crazy adventure of music didn't work out. I had my mind set on music, though. I went to Juilliard for my master's afterwards, and even with a couple high finishes in international competitions in my pocket already at that point, as professional musicians know, that's no guarantee of a career. Like actually making a career is a very different thing. So I had 3 years after Juilliard that I consider my years in the wilderness, where I did a little bit of this, a little bit of that, anything to add to the bank account to prolong the inevitable. David, maybe you should think about something else. Talk. And at the end of those 3 years, through paths I did not see coming, I ended up at the age of 27 as a concertmaster met. So there's a lot to say about that, but one of the most important things that happened to me is that there I reconnected with another first year player named Catherine Rowe, who I'd gone to school with, had been friends with, and who I am now married to. And she's the one who introduced me to God, saying that she grew up with it and she wasn't going to force it, but that I needed to know that if we were going to get married at some point, her parents were going to force the issue with me. So I kind of took that in, and the church we decided to get married at, because it had huge long aisle and beautiful courtyard with gardens, which is rare in New York City, of course, would make perfect photos. Well, to get married there, you had to join, and to join, you had to take a series of classes. And even somebody like me who knew very little about the church knew that it probably wasn't going to look very good if we attended the classes and skipped out on service right afterwards. So I started going, and I've never stopped. I would say it was a very slow light dimmer coming on from that point over a period of years. There was no burning bush for me. There was no hands on fire. There was no falling backwards and speaking tongues. Somewhere though, something changed, and those of you that read the recent newsletter might have seen already, or maybe in 2008 you tuned into the HD transmission from the Met of Massenet's Thais, where I played the meditation solo, which represents the title character's spiritual transformation. And I was interviewed, it was broadcast around the world, and I knew that at that moment, when they asked me, what does this mean to you personally, had come my time to speak up about my faith. I went from hoping that nobody would find out about it at work to being able to own it on international television. And those of you who are familiar with my story have heard me say this already. I was probably more nervous the whole week about what I was going to say than about playing. It seems silly now because I'm familiar but very friendly faces speaking about it very comfortably, but it was a huge step for me. But any fear I had of speaking about it was overshadowed by a fear that I would be struck by lightning or swallowed by a whale if I didn't take my opportunity. So here I am with you today. That's kind of the briefest I can summarize my my life.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. Beautiful. So when we were discussing this Zoom call the other day between the two of us, there's a phrase that kept coming up that you said that really stuck with me. So before we get into this sort of existential crisis that is the topic, you were saying that God is one, that music is one of God's language, that God's language to us is music, our talents and our passions. So we talk a lot about, as Christians, about, giving our gifts to God and playing for an audience of one and these sort of things. And that's all good as far as it goes. But I think you're getting at something deeper, no, that God's language to us and within us.
Well, like me, you serve the Lord first and foremost, but you also serve this art of music that we've wrapped our lives around. And I think this operates on so many levels. One, I think music has been with us since the very beginning. It's I guess in Genesis 1 and 2, we don't really hear about what music Adam and Eve played in the garden, but I think as soon they must have sung, right, in such an idyllic setting with birds and trees and fruit that didn't need any special tending to grow. It had to have been with us since the beginning. And I think the other element that always strikes me, and this is kind of where my music and wine festival in France really touched upon this, is that music is a universal language. You don't have to speak the same tongue for a piece of music to touch two people the same way. Or it doesn't even have to be the same way, but just to touch people who don't share a common tongue. And, we find this with opera or other sung, doesn't have to be opera, other sung vocal music. You don't even have to understand the text for it to touch you. It helps, of course, but so music has that power. And so because of that, I feel, just as you said, music is one of the languages that God has given to us. And I'd like to kind of turn it around. What we were discussing the other day is that you could conceivably touch somebody with music who doesn't know God, and they can be so moved that conceivably it opens the door for a conversation where that person comes to you or to somebody else to try to find out, why was I so touched by the music? And it leaves a vulnerable space where you can say to that person, well, the music is glorious, but the sort of deep emotion you feel, that's really God at work. And so I think that maybe we can bridge from this to the larger question of, is our calling still valid? I think that music being one of the languages of God and having received certain giftings, each person with their own, right? And Paul says that each person needs to exercise their talents and to appreciate the talents that each person has been given. If we have the gifting of music, then it's really our duty to him to further it in some way.
Indeed, indeed. So I've always had a very strong conviction that's that's in that space of vulnerability when we're moved. And initially, the composer, right, is moved. Initially, the composer is opening this space within themselves, or any artist, to get beyond. It's not just notes on the page, but it's an expression of something deeper. And when we're moved, whether it's by a sacred piece or by Shostakovich, it's within us. A space is opened. And the Holy Spirit, I believe that the Holy Spirit inhabits that space when we become vulnerable. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And, you mentioned Shostakovich. I had I didn't speak about it in the purely spiritual realm, but I had, I've had students ask me about composers like Shostakovich who are expressing something very dark. And if that's still, in this sort of journey, if that still has relevance, somebody like Berlioz, who was clearly on opium the whole time, can a Christian artist still perform that music? And I think, as we know, there's a piece of God in every person, no matter how holy or how fallen. And even though some of the music might have originated from a very dark place, there is the glory of God in it, in its ability to speak to and communicate with people. And I think, in fact, I was reading a friend of mine, fellow believer, sent me something from his daily reading plan that said that God shows himself most clearly when you're living in darkness, in a way. That if you're able to let his light shine in darkness, that's when it's the brightest. So, yeah, all of this is just this long way of agreeing with you that I think if we're receptive to all these forms of his communication through the music, we have the best chance of leaving ourselves in that vulnerable space where we can communicate in a plane above that.
Indeed. Well, speaking of vulnerability, I think a lot of us are feeling vulnerable right now. Particularly, those who are, I think of particularly of those who are freelancing, on, just out of conservatory hoping to teach, so this topic is of, is my very timely. Um, the last tune in was focused on a Catholic theologian and philosopher named Romano Guardini, and had a lot to do with self acceptance. So, but his, it's not the usual self acceptance of, just being comfortable in myself and feeling good about myself. It's really contextualized in what we've been talking about, our relationship to God, God's gifting to us, and the perspective that we have on wherever we are. As Paul says, I've learned how to be, in sickness and health, and rich and poor. I've learned how to be content, or to live my life with God. Um, what what do you think, David? What would you say to those who are in this position right now, basically have nothing to do, and not seeing a way forward, and not knowing if when this pandemic comes, God willing, comes to an end, that there will be something left for them to, a path for them to follow.
Well, there is, of course, no guarantee. And we know that even in so called good times, the path of a musician, especially a classical musician, is never guaranteed going forward. I've often spoken to the Christian fellowship at Juilliard saying that you don't want to hear this because you just got here, but there's a very good chance that a fair number of you will not end up in music. But don't lose heart because of that. I'm not saying that as a discouragement. Rather, you can be assured that you're here for a reason, that your life has led you through your practicing and your hard work and your talent that God gave you to this place, and you're going to take something from this that will help build your future, whether it's in music or not. And I think the same thing happens with career changes. My own shifting from more playing to more conducting, it's still within music, but David, you can attest it's not the same thing. And in the business, they don't look at it as the same thing. And it's not starting over, but there is a certain amount of having to retrace steps that I did when I was in my 20s. So, during this time, I kind of joke with students that I'm mentoring. I said, when I've talked to you in the past, you're probably saying, easy for him to say, he has all these accomplishments on his resume, but now I can put myself in the same shoes as you. I'm an aspiring musician again. And to be honest, through the middle of the summer, I began to think maybe I would try to brush up on other skills in case music didn't come around for a couple years. It was a very real possibility. So I had studied computer science for a couple years in college, so I went to online coding school, and I was programming in the first dozen lessons. I was like, oh, this is easy. I remember this. And then at a certain point, I kind of got to a bigger project and I hit the wall a little bit. And I thought, yeah, I might be good in these classes, but if you were to throw me on a job right now and they said, David, you're going to do this and you're going to do this part of the project and give it back to us in 5 days, I would be like a first year student at Juilliard who had played in orchestra a bunch of times and is very talented, thrown in the middle of the New York Philharmonic to play the Rite of Spring tonight. It would not be a good result. And what slowly started to come to me was God saying, be patient. You're on the right path. Don't give up the path. I have something planned for you. It's just going to take time. Now that's my story. For someone else, those looking into other avenues, the doors might start to open. I think the point is we have to be in a place where we're proactive, but also in constant communication with God so that we hear his voice in it. In this time, more than any other time, it's been so clear when the doors are open and when they're shut. And that's within music, that's outside of music, through all the different feelers I put out there trying to make things happen. You know, I see Dick Ryan nodding his head. He knows I like to make things happen. So, you know, I'm always trying, but so many of the doors are just stopped cold. And you could say, well, that's COVID, but no, it's not, because then other doors, which I would have never imagined in a million years, have flown open. So I know it's not a resolving sort of answer, but it's just that you have to think and you have to pray and you have to pray some more and try different things and try to discern where God is sending you. For some people, it's to stay the course. For some people, it's to take a 90-degree left turn. For others, it's a little of both. It's that's really the best I can offer, I think.
Well, and we're not unique that way as musicians.
Right.
No, I mean, the fact is, as Christians, I think we're called to. It's my conviction that we're called to live in the tension.
Yes.
And I find once again that the Holy Spirit is present in the tension, not when we've got everything resolved and we think that we have the clear path forward and we're just executing our plan. You know, that's it. I think it's actually not as likely that God's going to speak to us in that situation. Again, it comes back to vulnerability, right? That we open ourselves to God's Holy Spirit and God's leading. The other thing I would offer along with you is that we as musicians, we kind of always have this idea of what success looks like, and we follow that path doggedly. We followed that path, and when we don't hit the mark, we feel like we failed. Or even imagining, I'll give myself as an example. I never would have imagined living in South Dakota, ever in my life. I couldn't even put it on a map, and I'm an American, So, I could not have imagined the things that we've done here. Complete Mahler cycle, all of this stuff. These are things that I had in myself that I really wanted to do. That I could never, our Lakota project, things that never would have occurred to me. And when it came to that crisis point where I needed to make a decision, it was a step of faith into something new and prayerfully considered. So my offering in this question would be that if you're at home and you're praying and you're wondering where God is leading, have faith that God is leading, even though you can't see the path in front of you as clearly as you would like to or even expect to. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. As a family, we just read the end of Matthew 6 the other night, the whole do not worry section. Do not worry about tomorrow, for each day has enough trouble of its own. Of course, this doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't plan. He knows we're going to. But it's, I've always thought that a lot of it is a matter of expectation. And it's exactly what David said. We, as classical musicians, we picture successful career looks this way. And so I would hear early on in the pandemic, I would hear my wife on the phone with friends talking about, oh, how are you doing? You guys are furloughed. What are your plans? Are you going to stay? Are you going to move? And I would hear her say, I have no ambitions anymore. I would be great with settling in a small community somewhere where David is the conductor of some low-level community orchestra, and maybe I'll volunteer at the school or whatever. And I can hear cackles of laughter on the other end. It's like, oh, come on. But I think there's something in there is if you can be content with less, he's more likely to drop more on your plate, right? It's like the blessings. I don't know if it's just a matter of context and being able to appreciate it because you've lowered your expectations, but I think it's just not it's not a matter of just kind of pessimistically lowering what you say about yourself. It's kind of genuine willingness to serve humbly and know that that sort of act of serving is more valuable in its offering than all the trappings of success. And when you have that heart to serve, and I feel fortunate. I have the opportunity to serve our Heavenly Father, to serve the art, to serve the next generation by passing it, what I've learned onto them, both musically and spiritually. There's so many different aspects of serving. If you really embrace that, the other things just open up. When you don't define what success looks like for yourself, you'll find it.
Right. Right. It makes me think of this is a book that I could recommend to anybody today. It's by Jean-Pierre de Caussade, I'm probably getting the French pronunciation wrong, but the English translation is Abandonment to Divine Providence. And it was advice he gave 300 years ago. And it is that moment by moment of depending on God, and that you might not know what God's will for you is in the distant future, even though you might imagine it and hope for that God's will matches up with your own ambition and that sort of thing. But so we can't really know that, but what we can know is what God's will is for me right now today. When I wake up this morning, I don't have to think too much about what God's will is for me today, and it's one step in front of the other. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll put into the chat when we finish a very helpful quote from Thomas Merton. It was a Trappist monk, very important Christian thinker of the 20th century. And it begins with do not depend on the hope of results. And that what you're expecting may in fact, what you're hoping for may in fact turn out to be the wrong thing. And in the end, as you go through this journey, this life journey of success and failure, you'll come to the end and realize that relationship is really the only important thing. And again, this is not unique to musicians, but it's people. Yeah? Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with that. We touched on this the other day when I'm interviewed about what the hardest thing about being a concertmaster is. I always say dealing with people, and the interviewer is typically surprised. Oh, not playing solos, not leading an orchestra. I said, well, there's stress and pressure in that, of course, but dealing with people is the real art. And of course, as a conductor, it's even more so that way. And I think that just touches on what it's really about, is how you relate to other people is where you have the chance to be the salt of the earth, or the lamp that's on the hill rather than under a bowl. That's and that can be done without even mentioning his name. It's just what my wife and I always try to tell our kids is, if you carry that light, you don't have to speak about it. I mean, it's great if you have the opportunity to, but even without speaking about it, over time, people will wonder what makes that person different. Why does she have that light about her that other people don't? And again, that opens up spaces where we can talk about it. So it's relationships are where you have the chance to love your neighbor, not bullet points on your resume.
Indeed. Yeah, I had a pastor in New York City for many years as a Greek scholar, and he was preaching once on the Great Commission, go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations. And he said, probably the best translation of those words is, as you are going, make disciples.
Oh,
blew my mind as a 20 something year old. Um, and but but so I think it speaks to this, that basically, as we're musicians, whatever level you're on, whether you're a concertmaster at the Met, or still a student in conservatory, wherever it is, as you are going, you're making these relationships, right? And you're sharing your faith with words, with deeds, with love for music. All of this can be part of that, and that's what I. One of the things that's drawn me to Crescendo so much is because I feel like, as an organization, Crescendo embodies this idea. It's an invitation. Come, join us, walk with us, and as we are going, we will share our lives, our faith, our music, that sort of thing. We're coming to the end of our time, our chat together. Are there other things that you would like to share with people today, David?
I think we've pretty much covered it. The based on today's topic, I think we hit, for me, the biggest point up front is that I really do think that music is one of God's languages, and it opened up because it communicates across language barriers. It opens up other spaces that words don't. So that's you know, I know for individual musicians and for individual organizations, the sad truth of these times is that some of them will end up closing up shop or having to do other things. I know that. But spoken globally, I believe very much in not only the validity, but the need for music to continue. It's, the music itself will never die. Of course, it's a question of it remaining enough in public consciousness that it's not just, I mean, it's already a niche thing, but a super niche thing, right? Most of you are tuning in from Europe. Of course, it's so different there, the attitude towards music, with art being considered something much more essential, in the United States being unfortunately considered more like entertainment. But that's all the more reason why it's a calling for us to remind people that it's not that, it's an essential part of life and of our soul and spirit. I mean, if you see New York City now, it's a very sad and empty place. You take out the restaurants and you take out the culture, and you just have a lot of tall buildings where people are working and can do it from home and would probably rather do it from home anyway. So it's New York City, the life it's had is from the culture, from the arts, and that includes food and wine culture also. So it's a vital thing that we can't lose, and we need enough people to persist with it and stay with that calling.
Indeed. Well, David, thank you very much for talking with me. Thank you for sharing
It's
this.
a joy to be here and to see all of you, and I hope we can connect more in the future.